Hi everybody, today we're going to go through aero socks and we're going to give a little bit of a technical explanation as to why they work. So let's just have a quick look at our legs. We know that we have the top part of our leg, which is the thigh, which goes down here into the calf, attaches to our foot. We've got our body going up here, which we're just going to completely ignore. We're sitting on a seat. But the most important thing is we've got our foot attached to the crank through the pedal, and we've got a center of rotation there, and the legs are going around in circles. Now during this motion, if we were to assume that this top part of the leg is a cylinder, like this, and then this bottom part of the leg is a cylinder, like this, we can see that we have two components. We know that during the cycling motion, or pushing the pedals around, this angle here remains relatively small, which means that this part of the leg up here, we're just really simplifying things here. We've got our cylinder, which is the thigh, is more or less exposed to an axial flow. So the flow is going like this. This actually is kind of the top of the knee, goes like this. Again, very simple, but we're not worrying about the top of the leg, we're worrying about this part of the leg. So here we've got a cylinder again, and that's going to be exposed to a flow like this, V infinity, which is a perpendicular flow to a cylinder, which is essentially one of the fundamental problems in fluid dynamics, which has been studied extensively, which is why we have a lot of data for these types of flows, which is why we can have a look at how aero socks work based on a cylinder assumption. So the Reynolds number is a really important parameter in terms of fluid dynamics and modeling problems. So the Reynolds number is equal to the velocity times a characteristic length times the density divided by the viscosity. Now in cycling, we're at sea level, which means the density and the viscosity of the air are not changing, and they're easily reported. So the two parameters that will be changing are the velocity and the length. So if we take our 2D cylinder, or take our cylinder, sorry, and make a cut here so that we've got a cross-sectional area, this here is the length, which is coming from this equation. Now, because we are not a perfect cylinder, and we're not a perfect cylinder anyway, but let's just say that we have a calf muscle which gets bigger as we move up our leg. So we've got an ankle here which has got a smaller chord or characteristic length, and the characteristic length increases. So as our if we look at our foot again, if we're wearing our sock up to here, the characteristic length is going to be different here, 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 and here. Yeah. And also we have the bike moving forwards at a different speed. So let's say we're going downhill on a section, we're going to be going 55 kilometers an hour. The velocity is going to be changing there, and then we're going slightly uphill and we're on, let's say, down to 30 kilometers an hour. Just an idea. So we have this operating range of our leg, which is in this case the cylinder exposed to a perpendicular flow. Velocity is changing due to the forward speed of the bike, and the length, the characteristic length, is dependent on the size of our leg and the muscles. So let's have a look at the drag of a cylinder and the impact of surface roughness. So just to start off, we're going to look at this legend here, which is smooth cylinder and then various surface roughness characteristics, and then also the minimum and maximum Reynolds number value, which I've calculated for my leg. So we can just go through the Reynolds number first. So at my ankle, I have a very small diameter, and at the top of the calf, I have a bigger diameter. This point is the bigger diameter of my calf at 55 kilometers an hour forward speed, and this one here is at 30 kilometers an hour, 30 kilometers an hour at my ankle. So based on these low speeds and low characteristic lengths and the high speeds with the big characteristic lengths, we have an operating range in terms of Reynolds number for my leg, which remember is this cylinder. Now what we can see on the side here is we have this smooth cylinder, which is, I don't know, let's assume we have perfectly shaved legs and we're wearing ankle socks. We can see that the drag remains relatively constant throughout this operating range of my leg, which means the drag is going to remain at this value of about 1.15. And if we start adding roughness, we can see we have various roughness characteristics here. This K on D ratio is the length of the grain size of the roughness. So let's imagine that they've put some sand or dirt or grit on the surface of a cylinder. And this is the size related to the diameter of the cylinder. So this is that ratio. You can see if I have a fine ratio here, that the drag remains relatively constant as well, but it drops off and it goes down to a minimum value here of about 0.7. If I change that roughness, I can achieve a value of this, this, or this, but also considering this whole range here. So essentially what we're trying to say is that by adding roughness to the surface of the cylinder, we can vary the drag characteristics. And by having different values of roughness, the drag can vary quite significantly. So at this point you might be asking, why the hell is this guy talking about roughness when I want to know about aero socks? Well, the aero socks that I have, at least, they have a whole bunch of ridges which run along the sock. Now these are, aerodynamically speaking, boundary layer trips, and boundary layer trips cause the boundary layer to transition from laminar to turbulent. A turbulent boundary layer is a higher Reynolds number, which we were just talking about before. We could see that at the higher Reynolds number you see a drop off in drag. So essentially we want to put stuff on the surface of this cylinder to make it transition to turbulent, or to have a smaller wake, because a boundary layer which is turbulent will stay attached to the surface for longer. So these ridges are essentially surface roughness, and that's how the socks are working. So what are we actually doing by adding this roughness? So we've got two pictures here, and I'm going to mention the source where I'm getting this stuff from at the end. We have a cylinder between a Reynolds number of 10 to the 4 and 10 to the 5, which is more or less where our legs are operating. We can see that we have this really big wake structure here. We have a positive pressure on this side from the stagnation of the flow at the leading edge, and then a big negative pressure from the separated flow in the wake. So we've got this operating on this whole back surface of the cylinder, which is a really large area. So we've got the negative pressure acting on a large area, which is causing a big drag force. And this one is after the critical Reynolds number, where we saw it drop right off to 0.3. This isn't what we achieved with the adding of the surface roughness, but it's just an idea of what's happening to the flow. This negative pressure area still exists. We still have this positive and negative, but the wake is a lot smaller, and it's operating, or it's acting on a reduced area of the cylinder, which means we are reducing the drag. Now, I understand this is more or less a static position of the leg, so we're not assuming that there's any movement of the leg. This is the cylinder is fixed in this space, but it gives an idea of what the effect of adding roughness to a surface can do in terms of a cylinder. Okay, so we got a lot of dots here on these plots, and these plots are the individual drag coefficient plots against, sorry, they're not annotated, CD versus Reynolds number. And essentially we have my leg, which I've measured, like I said before. here, we've got 4 stations, 1, 2, 3, 4, and my ankle here is the point which is there, and then the Reynolds number increases as we go down, and there's orange, and then there's another orange one somewhere here. So essentially for each of these speeds, orange is 30 kilometers an hour and red, the maximum one, is 55 kilometers an hour. I've got these 4 stations which represent different Reynolds numbers, so we get an idea of the operating range of my leg in terms of drag and Reynolds number. So what we can see for this first one up here is that even though we are within the Reynolds number range where we see a drop in drag coefficient, it's really only for these red points and a couple of these blue points, which is the 50-55 kilometer area. For the rest of them, which are 30, 35, 40, they are still within this constant area, constant drag area, which means we're not really going to be getting any savings if our aero socks have this amount of roughness. As we move over here into this next range, next roughness area, we can see that my leg starts to work a little bit better in terms of drag savings through a wider range. So we got the 50, the 50, 55, 50, and 45 kilometers an hour, whereas my ankle up here, which is the lowest Reynolds number at 30 kilometers an hour, is still at the high drag area. Again, as we move down here, different roughness again, we've got a bigger operating range in the lower drag area, and then again, as we increase it further, we're up here. These points don't really aren't correct because their interpolation, I didn't have enough data for the interpolation. But anyway, you can see that while the roughness of the surface changes the drag, you also have a velocity range or a calf dimension and velocity range where you're going to get your maximum savings. And while here the drop-off is pretty significant down to 0.5, I can't get my legs to operate in that area. Here I'm operating in a significant savings, a drag coefficient savings of about 0.4. It's not as low as here, but I can have a larger range of velocities where these aero socks are going to be working. So this is just highlighting the fact that different aero socks will probably have different surface roughnesses, and they might have been tested in the wind tunnel on different size calves to yours. So the aero savings are going to be specific to your leg structure and also to the free stream velocity, as in how fast you're riding the bike. And you just hope that you have a sock where the reduction is operating, or the reduction is effective through a bigger range of velocities and calf dimensions. So to summarize, if we treat our leg as a simple cylinder, we can have a look at a lot of aerodynamic plots and wind tunnel experiments that have been conducted over time to look at the effect of surface roughness, like this, on a circular cylinder which is perpendicular to the flow. We need to consider that at each cross-section of our leg, the area is going to be different, which is going to affect the Reynolds number. We saw that we have plots like this, where we have different savings associated with the Reynolds number, and we want to optimize our savings to be in an operating range which is a realistic range for velocity, as in the speed of the bike, and also for our calf dimensions. For those of you who are interested in where I got my plots from, it's a book called Fluid Dynamic Drag, which is presented by Dr. Herner. It's a very old book, but it's got a lot of important information in there if you're looking at understanding drag. So thanks for watching my video, and I'll be posting more in the future.